It is Friday, March 10th. Let's talk PlayStation. Happy Mario Day, everyone. Not quite a PlayStation thing, obviously, but it's March 10th. I feel like we have to say that. But as always, let's start off with our PS Plus reminder. The March PS Plus Essential Games are now live on PSN. Go claim those, get that done. It's Battlefield 2042, Minecraft Dungeons, and also Code Vein on PS4, so go claim those games. Now, for our first story, let's talk about the new PS5 system software update. As we often do, we did a video when it launched showcasing every single changelog item. The big headline features in this firmware is the Discord voice calls. Still kind of annoying that you have to transfer them from PC or mobile, but hopefully there's going to be tighter integration directly on console later. But for now, we have that. There's also VRR for 1440p support and the redesigned game hubs. Really, it's super cool that we can now update controllers wirelessly. That's so convenient. And also, I did not think they would address this, but we saw this in the beta, obviously, but it's the discretion, or rather, no longer a discretion of a disc versus digital game. Really annoying when that comes up. It's not often, but if you say install a disc game, then down the road you want to buy it digitally, or let's say it's on PS Plus Essential or Extra, you'd rather just have that license, right? But you'd have to delete and reinstall the game, which is just kind of annoying. So I'm surprised that they actually did address this. So now you can just go to PS Plus if there's a game that you already have installed on disc. You can just claim it, and I say claim, you really have to hit download again, but that will override your license, so you don't have to download it, but that will allow you to start launching that game without the disc inserted. That is very handy. Now, of course, it wasn't just PS5. PS4 also got a brand new firmware update, 10.50, and at this point in the PS4 lifecycle, kind of obvious, but the console is taking more of a backseat with its firmware updates, so it didn't have a beta, but it's also something where the updates that we're seeing now, it's just kind of the very basic core functionalities that are being added to PSN that PS5, of course, is going to get as well, but PS4, the changelog here is only for accessing the authorized apps, so like, for example, seeing Discord, also, being able to see friends online if they're using the PlayStation mobile app, the Unicode 15 support, and also the cross-play support. Being able to see friends, being able to see people that are on other platforms during multiplayer games, that's also available on PS4 as well. But yeah, that's all PS4 got, and at this point, that's the only thing PS4 is going to continue to get. No major features, but some of these basic things that PS5 is going to get in terms of core PSN functionality. Moving on to our next story, it's been a while since we covered a patent that Sony has filed where it's kind of strange or unusual. And, Sony, like most companies, will file hundreds, thousands of patents. Most of them do not get used, but they're always looking at new or experimental technologies. They're doing R&D left and right. And so a lot of the times these things are pretty weird. This one was highly publicized this past week, and it was filed 2 years ago, but recently published March 7th. It's called Dynamic Game Intervention, and we'll just read the description here verbatim. It says, systems and methods for determining excessive motions or strained positions based on inputs associated with gameplay of game titles. A game intervention server may evaluate based on learning models, posture, and physical motions of players for repetitive, unbalanced, or excessive motions, as well as gameplay quality patterns, and compare to thresholds for identifying unhealthy conditions. The game intervention server may make recommendations regarding breaks, stretches, warm-up, cooldown, curbing extended periods of play, etc. Notifications may be overlaid on screen with the ability to pause play without exiting game session. So basically, this is saying that when you're playing your game, and depending on the PlayStation hardware or peripheral or whatever else that you're playing that can identify motion, could be something like VR or a camera peripheral that's watching how you sit or lay, or maybe you're slouching, maybe you're doing weird jerking motions or something. Like eventually the console and the UI is going to make a suggestion to you like, hey, maybe you should chill out for a second. Fix your posture. That's not very good for you. Giving you, kind of that wagging, stern finger point that you're not playing in a healthy way, which it's funny, but at the same time, it kind of makes sense to a degree, although that would be a really interesting situation if they deploy this where it's something where your console can sometimes be a bit patronizing because you're laying in a very uncomfortable way, or you're not playing the game to satisfactory conditions. But as I said, there's we see so many of these patents, and this was a kooky one that, again, got a little bit of publicity this past week. So recently there's been some speculation that maybe we know who's voicing Wolverine for Marvel's Wolverine on PlayStation 5. This was initially brought forth by the TikTok user Jack_Whiteman7. They posted this video claiming an old Instagram video posted by Steve Blum is evidence that he's voicing the new Wolverine for PS5. In that video, Steve talks about how he's doing motion capture for a video game that he's signed an NDA for, but it was more of a funny message he was giving to Roger Craig Smith. And on Instagram itself, the video title says, quote, "Throwback to a facial motion capture project I did, and shout out to my friend at Roger Craig Smith." And this post was back in December. Now, Steve Blum, I mean, he voices a lot. He does a lot of projects, both in video games, off of video games. It's a very iconic voice. He's done Wolverine before, so... but due to the nature of that alone, that means I think it would be not so much a stretch, but I think far too early to make that kind of suggestion. Although I do think he would make a great Wolverine for the PS5 game. But if you saw this story this past week, I think it's worth noting that he does a lot of this kind of work, both in and off games, right? Both in and outside of games. So I don't really think there's a whole lot to say here beyond maybe, but also maybe not. Moving on to some fresh details for The Last of Us Part 1's PC release. As we often see, there's the PS blog post and the new PC features trailer, which confirms what we were kind of expecting out of a lot of these PS Studio PC releases. So this game has AMD FSR 2.2 support, NVIDIA DLSS, there is VSync, also ultra-wide support for 21:9 and 32:9 displays. There's adjustable textures, shadows, reflections, etc. They also released the recommended specs with a handy little infographic, and I will say, I think this is the first PS Studios PC release where the absolute minimum, they still recommend an SSD. Pretty much everything we've seen thus far has always had an HDD to start, but then any spec bump after that is normally an SSD. But yeah, this one across the board, they're recommending an SSD. Probably going to be more commonplace in the PC space in the coming years, so not entirely surprising, but still something where, at least for a PS Studios game, this would be the first one. Now for our next story, it does seem to be a growing trend here where people are buying a lot of PS5s. It's almost as if people have wanted to buy this console for the past 2 years but couldn't, because we've got more wild PS5 sales figures to go over. So in the UK, we can see new data published by GamesIndustry.biz from the GfK panel. Year-to-date PS5 hardware is up 180% compared to the first 2 months of last year. But again, that is something where the stock levels were really low back then. But in Europe, it's a similar story. PS5 sales were 5 times higher this February versus the same time last year. And for Japan, not only is the console consistently outselling Switch finally, after a combination of stock and declining Switch sales, but Sony has now reached the 3 million units sold milestone in this territory. And that means PS5 reached this milestone in 120 weeks, beating the PS3 at 125 weeks and PS4 at 131 weeks. Now, I don't know if that's... I wouldn't say it's impressive, because it's Japan where, you know, for 2 years the stock has been abysmal. So I wouldn't say impressive, but surprising for sure, considering that, you know, up to this point it did not seem like PS5 would be able to track that closely to PS3 and PS4 in terms of reaching 3 million sold within a similar time frame, right? So it seems like they were able to, you know, catch up very quickly, considering that the past 6 weeks or so, console sales have been like 60 to 90 something thousand every week consistently. Although we have mentioned recently that there's still a situation where all these consoles might not be reaching actual Japanese customers. So some of these consoles might be getting sold overseas, although we have finally seen that some actual PS5 software is charting in the top 10, which Hogwarts Legacy, not surprising, that game globally has done gangbusters, but that charted in Japan. Also Wulong Fallen Dynasty, and I think also Octopath Traveler's PS5 version is in there as well. So at least some Japanese customers appear to be picking the console up and also buying software with it, so that's good. But we should always keep in mind that Japanese customers are more inclined to also buy games digitally as well, which are not tracked with this top 10 that we often refer to. But either way, I mean, it's still surprising that they were able to catch up and actually exceed that milestone or beat that milestone faster than PS3 and PS4 in that time frame, right? So the console market, traditional console market, is smaller in Japan, but at least Sony has been able to do similar numbers, really a little bit better here for PS5. Moving on to some acquisition news, or maybe speculation is the better way to phrase it, but it's something where, if you remember back in 2021, Sony had put their sort of plan or strategy out there where they had mentioned that they had earmarked about $18.4 billion for the next 3 years, and that money would be used specifically for merger and acquisition or strategic investment. And, since then, we have seen them use a lot of that money. Now, that money is split between not only Sony Interactive Entertainment, but the entire Sony group. So Sony Pictures, Sony Music, they're all using that pool of money. But in terms of SIE, they did get a good portion of it by, acquiring Housemarque, Nixxes Software, Firesprite and Fabric Games, Bluepoint Games, Valkyrie Entertainment, Haven Studios, Bungie. They also picked up Repeat.gg, if you remember that, continuing their focus on esports. And they also made investments in From Software, Devolver, Epic Games. Anyway, recently during a Morgan Stanley Technology Media Conference, Sony CFO and soon-to-be President Hiroki Totoki confirmed they've still got about $5 billion left for the current year. Now, presumably that also means by next year they'll just allocate more funds to this, which is more investment, more M&A activity, but they've gone on record before to say that they will go outside of their allowance if some kind of opportunity comes up. So that could be them, raising money and taking on debt or doing something if an opportunity comes up where, let's say, somebody wants to sell and the numbers make sense and, the conversations go well, but that's all just... that was just theoretical, right? Because we're already 1 year left on this current budget. They've got $5 billion left, and that's not just for Sony Interactive. That's for every division. So they've stuck to their budget pretty well here. But this topic naturally does go into the whole who should Sony buy next thing for PlayStation, and I'm not sure what else to really add here beyond what we normally say at this point. We've got a history here now to look back on, right? The past 2 years and how they've done this so far. Before it was always long-standing partners, but they've really tied the knot on all those long-standing partners. And now it's been something where it's been, newer studios or studios without this deep catalog of titles that would put a high price on them, right? So that would be like Firesprite. So they're doing it in a very affordable way, but they're still recognizing the talent that's at stake, and that's why they've been doing it the way they're doing it so far. Bungie being kind of the outlier. It's obviously a big one, but something where they just want the talent and they're going to remain independent and keep doing, third-party platform publishing. So if we consider the past 2 years and how they've done it so far, what kind of trajectory does that put them on moving forward? The current year, they've only got $5 billion left across the entire Sony group. That's a decent chunk of change to do something. Maybe their last big play here could be the one that I'm predicting, which was at the start of this year. I said, maybe this is where they'll finally do that minority investment into Square Enix, where the reason for that is it's all kind of falling into place, where I'm sure Sony does not want to drop the kind of cash that it would take to pick up all of Square. That would be more than $5 billion, but you also get the baggage that Square comes with. So why not do a minority investment, get what you really want out of it, which is probably the Final Fantasy IP, securing that exclusivity. Square has already said they want to sell stakes in their studios, so I'm sure that's something that is certainly being looked at right now. So maybe it happens this year, maybe next year. That could be the next big play, but we do have to look at what Hiroki said during this recent call with the Morgan Stanley conference, right, where he had brought up again the monthly active users and trying to reach more beyond what PS5 can do. This goes into the talk we've had before about the console space, where every generation, it doesn't matter, you might do a little better, a little worse. Sometimes they might do really bad, like a Wii U year, or a Wii U generation, but generally there's only so many people that you can sell consoles to. If you want to expand or exceed that number, you're going to have to get into PC, mobile, and we know that Sony, at least with PC, they've picked up Nixxes software. They're going to be doing, 10-something live service games for the next 4-something years, and those titles are going to be launching on PS5, PC, day and date. They're already doing a back catalog of titles, so we see what they're doing with PC. What are we not seeing, or not seeing enough of? I would say mobile. We only have Savage Game Studios so far. They're still building out the PlayStation Studios mobile division, so I can't see how this is not an area where they're going to be investing more, maybe buying more studios, forming studios. Who knows how that's going to look. They'll probably pick up 1 or 2 very established mobile studio developers, and there's only a handful to choose from, but considering there's no precedent on how they would approach this space, I think anything can happen there. So that's probably a big area moving forward. Not to say they're not going to do standard 2D PS5 stuff. I know that's what people here want to hear about, and that's why eventually I'm sure they will do something that at this point would be considered uncharacteristic, and that's where the speculation of Sony should buy this publisher or this well-known developer that that doesn't normally fit that formula that we've always talked about. I'm sure they'll get there eventually, and when that does happen, we'll talk about it, but for now, this is what I'm kind of expecting in the short term with this, say, $5 billion left, and eventually getting to 2024 where more money will open up. Moving on to The Last of Us HBO. We haven't had a story here for a while, but episode 8 was the most recent one. Episode 9 coming up this weekend. That's the last episode, and at least for last week's episode, we can say that one had the biggest debut so far at 8.1 million viewers, which also represents a massive jump from the initial 4.7 million that episode 1 got. So a lot of people are tuning in, they're committed, and they're really enjoying the show from what I'm seeing, at least. I have been having a great time with the show. I think it's awesome. I can't believe that they really did nail most of this show. And I kind of got into this bad habit the past 3 weeks, which is watching a lot of reactions on YouTube from all walks of life with this series. People that have played the games, played a lot of the games, so they know all the things that are going to come up, and they're surprised when things are different. People that have never played the games, and it's so fun to watch all these different reactions of like, oh, this was in a video game, or oh, I can't believe they changed this, or wow, this scene landed a lot better, or this. I love the conversation. I love hearing all these different takes and opinions on it. That's been as fun as watching it, and not a bad thing. It's just that's how I've been spending my last 3 weeks, which is kind of a waste of time, but man, I really, I've been enjoying the show a lot. I will say, my one criticism, and this is one that I'm seeing a lot, and there's a counter argument here, but it's the matter of there's not a whole lot of combat or infected, and I would agree, and the counter argument to that I see immediately as well. It's a lot more grounded as a TV show, and that is something where I also agree. I think there's a fine balance that you have to look for here when it comes to, I guess, making the pacing and the moments feel more earned. That's I think the core issue that many are seemingly bringing up, especially if you played the games, right? That's why the show I think feels rushed, because it's a lot of the big cutscenes and the big moments all squeezed together, and they're getting a lot done in each episode because there's only 9, but because you don't have all the gameplay sequences in between, you're losing out on an hour and a half of Joel and Ellie walking around, having all these optional conversations, having these little quips and talks as they explore buildings and kill a bunch of infected and raiders. And when you take all of that out, a lot of the big scenes in the show, they do feel unearned. But you can't have a little girl and a 50-year-old man on a TV show and you can't believably sell them killing hundreds of clickers and infected and raiders. It just doesn't make sense. So I would agree, but it would have, I don't know. I think it would have been better to maybe have 1 or 2 more episodes in this back half of the series to give some of these bigger moments some breathing room. It does seem like they kind of have a checklist per episode of like, here's all the moments we have to hit and let's get them done all in one episode. And it is cool that they're like doing all these scenes, sometimes shot for shot, line for line, and they look so good and they're just like the games and they're so carefully crafted and the love is there. You can see it from everybody involved, and I can't appreciate it more. But man, it would, I think, go a long way in having just a few extra combat sequences that make sense for what they're trying to sell. Kind of like the first and really the only, clicker scene. There is a lot in episode 5, obviously, but the first scene where they only kill 2 of them, and it's not 2 clickers and 5 runners. It's not 3 clickers and 2 runners. It's just 2 clickers and they barely make it out of that, right? Maybe having a few more of those sequences would have gone a long way, where they're just able to escape and you see more dialogue and things like that. Maybe that would have helped. But even with that criticism aside, I find that everybody has done a fantastic job. Craig, Neil, Bella, Pedro, everybody involved. It's just I love what they've done, and I cannot wait to see their take on the ending to this series. All right, let's get into our latest update for the Microsoft acquisition of Activision Blizzard. This one is a doozy. We're hearing more about Sony's side of things, and maybe their true intentions are finally being put out there, which I don't think anything about this is going to be all too surprising, but let's break down what recently happened. So, the UK CMA has published SAE's observations on the CMA's remedies notice, which is in connection with the CMA's provisional findings. If you recall, this was the initial remedies document that made the suggestion of divesting parts of the ABK business or just prohibiting it altogether. Anyway, this is a 13-page document, and Sony has made some bold, albeit expected, comments. Unsurprisingly, a lot of this is Sony simply agreeing with the CMA's findings, and the main argument here is that Sony is claiming behavioral remedies wouldn't be effective, giving a bunch of examples on how Microsoft could degrade Call of Duty in terms of price, quality, ignoring PlayStation-specific features like the controller's haptics, or availability on subscription. Sony also argues that negotiations with a Microsoft-owned Activision versus an independent one would be hard to address. Who would set prices and how? What is determined as fair, and so forth. Sony also says Microsoft, even when operating in good faith, would still be incentivized to prioritize the Xbox version of these games, giving the example that a PlayStation version could launch with bugs or errors that emerge on the final level, or maybe later updates, and if these weren't addressed in a timely manner, the gaming community would lose confidence in PlayStation as a go-to venue to play Call of Duty. Sony claims Microsoft hasn't shown real commitment to reaching a negotiated outcome, only engaging when they sensed bad regulatory outlook and favoring media representation over talking with SIE. Now, there's some redacted info coming up here, but Sony is more or less saying Microsoft's public parody statements don't align with what's legally binding in their on-paper offer, saying there's plenty of wiggle room for them to eventually deviate. Sony has also confirmed that Microsoft has put a proposed license fee on Call of Duty for having the game available on PlayStation Plus Extra. Sony says this would commercially destroy SIE's subscription business. They would either have to raise the price of PS Plus or not offer Call of Duty at all. Sony then brings up examples where the behavioral remedies didn't work for Microsoft's past commitments. Now, we should also mention Activision Blizzard's EVP of Corporate Affairs and CCO, Lulu Cheng Maservi, mentioned on Twitter that during the February 21st EU hearing in Brussels, that the SIE CEO said, and I quote, "I don't want a new Call of Duty deal, I just want to block your merger." And also, just to make sure that we're covering everything here, I'll also bring up this recent interview that Phil Spencer did for the Xbox On channel. This is where he reaffirms the commitment again that they want the game equal on all platforms, so no exclusive skins or guns or anything like that, no content agreement like Sony has or like Microsoft did have on 360. They just want the game equal across all platforms and the best version that it can be for that particular system, which, kind of apply more to like, say, Nintendo, where the game is going to be the best that it can be for, say, Nintendo Switch, but more or less reaffirming the same thing we've always heard. Now, having gone over all that, I guess we can finally say we see Sony's true stance here, and that may sound dumb because we always knew they were against it, but in fairness, we did not know how against it they were, if that makes sense, because, we speculated before that obviously Sony and Microsoft are negotiating, but it is more a matter of, is Sony saying no to every offer that Microsoft makes, or is Microsoft or is Sony making counter offers that Microsoft is unwilling to agree to? That was just, that's speculation, but it seems like if Lulu is to be believed, then yeah, it sounds like Sony was always saying no. And based on how Lulu has been, talking on Twitter about this during the entire merger process, she's been very outspoken about the whole thing. So she does come off as, truthful, but, we don't know how exactly what the context was of how Jim Ryan said this. If it was during the hearing, maybe outside of the hearing in passing, maybe he said it, in the hallway to a Microsoft exec or Activision exec. I don't really know. Although that doesn't really matter because the intentions are there. They don't want this merger to go through. And that's where I again pose the question of why would they allow this to happen? That's been, I think, a really surprising part of this. And of course, as we said before, it goes into platform biases. So people that play on PlayStation, they don't want it to go through. People that play on Xbox, they want it to go through. But I am really surprised that there's been a lot of this sentiment of, Sony's being ridiculous or they should accept Microsoft's offer. 10 years is generous. It's content parity. They can put it on Plus. And it's like, okay, but like if I'm Sony, and the thing is, I agree in that at this point it seems very clear Microsoft in good faith will ship Call of Duty on PlayStation for 10 years. It will be completely on par with the Xbox version. They'll make the best PS5 version they can, even going into PlayStation 6. It seems that they're very much committed to doing just that. But if I'm Sony, I'm still concerned about year 11. But, they're still making arguments today about how they could still make the game, degrade it in the short term, or, making the typical bad faith arguments that they've been making about how they're going to put bugs in it or something. Not intentionally, but you know what I mean? Like, a lot of this stuff is just kind of, again, Sony lawyers doing what they need to do, but I'm still just shocked. Like, there's just, I don't see how Sony would not... Sony doesn't, it's very clear that they would not want this to go through, obviously. Now, I do find it also interesting that Sony did lay out the PS Plus thing, though, because that was kind of a big deal when Microsoft also laid that out, is that they quelled the fears of, hey, it won't be just Game Pass exclusivity and 70 on PlayStation. We'll offer it on PS Plus as well. Now, that looked good for Microsoft, but that's also a catch-22 for Sony, because what are they supposed to do with that kind of offer? And now we're seeing it, because clearly Call of Duty is such a big property. That's why this whole thing is happening to begin with, that to offer it on a subscription service, it would be a fee so high that Sony would not reasonably be able to accept it. I mean, even today, the reason why Call of Duty is not on subscription is because Activision themselves would not do it. The financial viability of it makes no sense whatsoever. You sell the game a la carte, that's where you make the most money. They would only do it if they were owned by Microsoft, where they would be able to eat that cost. They even recently said Game Pass reached profitability, but, be that as it may, the second you pick up Activision Blizzard and, have to deal with all the liabilities of owning and running that, you're back in the red pretty fast, I would say. But they can do it. They can eat that cost. Sony, we know, does not want to operate PlayStation Plus like that. They want to stay profitable. They want their deals to make sense. And so they even say, outright, like, we would have to raise the fee, or that just, we can't afford it. We can't offer it. And that's where we're going to look weak, not having the game available on our service versus Microsoft doing it on Game Pass. There's just, the implications are too high. That's why this whole thing has been happening. There's no other game franchise that really gets as big as Grand Theft Auto, FIFA, or Call of Duty, and that's why this entire process has been such a big deal. But you've got both companies at this point trying to be about face, and they care about their own bottom line. And I will say for Microsoft, it's pretty surprising that they've done this good of a job at looking like the good guy here when it's Microsoft, spending $68 billion on a merger, and they're looking like the good guys just off the premise that Sony has a lot of exclusive games, and they've been the console leader for a long time. So just by that merit alone, they should be okay with this. I don't know. The whole thing has just been so weird at this point and kind of exhausting, but that is our latest update for the ABK situation. Now, with all that said, it is time for Let's Talk Plus, the weekly Let's Talk PlayStation giveaway where one of you can win a $10 PSN code. I would like to congratulate this viewer right here. I'll be contacting you very soon via email or Twitter. And if you would like to win a $10 PSN code, it's so simple. You can follow the link down below. Supporting this channel a number of ways can gain you an entry, and I'll announce the winner next week because I'm trying to help pay for your games. Those are all the news stories from this past week that I wanted to talk about with you all. And our Wednesday video was looking at the new PS5 system software update. So as per usual, that's a good way to check out every or nearly every changelog item on there. So go check that out if you haven't just yet. But also we'll try and get back on schedule for an upload on this coming Tuesday. But also we might have some additional PSVR 2 content as well, some more coverage. Depends on the scheduling, obviously, but that should be coming fairly soon as well. But otherwise, that is pretty much it. So that concludes this week's episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. I'm Ryan Benecki. Thank you all so much for talking with me, and I will see you all next Friday. Hello? How'd it go? The guy that plays Joel in the games, that voices him and he did the motion capture, he was in episode 8. He was David's like right-hand man. So the guy that eventually Ellie takes a meat cleaver to right after, you know that scene? He got the medicine and then she like hit him with a meat cleaver when that's Troy Baker. He voices Joel in the games.